Well, I'm Jaden Jefferson, and welcome to this week's episode of Behind the Byline from the Toledo Free Press. I'm right now joined by City of Toledo Chief Prosecutor Rebecca Facey, and we're discussing an upcoming event that the prosecutor's office and the city is putting on, Breaking the Cycle of Violence, this summit that's happening. Could you speak to the reason why the city wanted to do this event?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about breaking the cycles of violence. This is going to be a summit bringing together professionals as well as youth in our community to talk about the dangers in dating violence relationships, as well as human trafficking and domestic violence. So the city certainly cares a lot about these issues. Obviously, there's a lot of focus on violence prevention in our community and recognizing that gender-based violence is really one of these issues that deserves a lot of attention, and wanted the opportunity to bring as many folks together to talk about different ways that we can address it and really engage youth in this conversation so that we can start these conversations much earlier.
Just to back up a bit and offer some context to this issue, we obviously saw in 2020 there was this sharp rise in crime in general, but domestic violence was one of those primary issues because people were stuck at home, and in some cases, these were people stuck at home with bad partners and bad relationships. And so what was the impact that the pandemic had just on domestic violence locally?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, this is one of those crimes that is consistently high in our community and across the country. Toledo Municipal Court sees about 2,000 domestic violence misdemeanor offenses every year, and we have seen quite a few homicides related to intimate partner violence in the last several years here in Toledo as well. So, yeah. COVID was not kind to anyone and did put a lot of strain and pressure on already unhealthy relationships. But again, an opportunity to start talking about red flags for youth to understand what is a good relationship, what is healthy and what is not, so that they can understand those things early and often to hopefully prevent being involved in an abusive relationship.
And that's one of the things I want to zero in on, because this Breaking the Cycle of Violence Summit, that is one of the focuses, is youth. And why would you say it's important to start early with identifying the signs of gender dating violence and ways of preventing toxic relationships?
Well, we know that teenagers are involved in very intense relationships, always have been, right? You know, that first love is so strong, and feelings run high. And when it's not healthy, when it's possessive, when there's jealousy involved, when there's controlling behaviors, and we have seen an enormous increase in that with technology, social media, the ability to contact your partner at all times of day and night.
Certainly complicates things.
It really does. And so we want to make sure to equip young people with the tools to recognize those unhealthy signs and know how to address them when they come up.
Yeah, and what would you say has been the impact just that social media has had? Because obviously there is the good in that people can be connected to resources and see different signs of domestic violence, but at the same time there is the abusive nature as well.
Absolutely. You know, when I was in high school, if somebody wanted to call me, they had to call the house phone and go through my parents to get to me. Now, you know, pretty much everyone is connected on their own device. And, you know, that, like I said, can be happening 24 hours a day, even in the middle of the night sometimes. So definitely more connection can be a good thing, but in an abusive context, it can be a really controlling and manipulative thing.
Yeah, what would you say have been some of the cases that you've seen, obviously not to speak to specifics, but what have been some of the different things that you've observed just with social media in terms of adults as well?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of jealousy that happens in social media and on phones in general. Partners that don't trust each other want to go through each other's phones and see who you've been talking to, and you know that starts a lot of criminal cases that we see here in the court. Is, you know, somebody finding that somebody else was on their phone, which is unfortunate. And in healthy, mature relationships, you know, you're allowed to talk to whoever you want. And if your partner trusts you and, you know, you're in a good space, then it doesn't matter who you're talking to. But certainly when jealousy reigns supreme, then it rears its ugly head and can often turn to violence.
And that's one of those red flags that we talk about when it comes to domestic violence and toxic relationships in general is just that lack of privacy, lack of trust. What are some other red flags that people of all ages should be considering when they enter into a new relationship?
I think a huge one is isolation, right? That goes along with jealousy when you don't want your partner to have anyone else in their life, and certainly anyone else positive. You hear from a lot of victims that they've really lost their friends and family due to an abusive relationship. And, be it that they weren't allowed to hang out with them and or once the family and friends find out about abuse and want to be able to help the victim. But of course, it's a cycle, and it's not as easy as just leaving, like so many people would think, that friends and family really get frustrated and they, back away from those relationships. And we often see victims of domestic violence come to court with no support at all. And that's ultimately what an abuser is looking for, someone they can completely isolate and be the only person the victim can depend on.
You just mentioned one of the things we hear often with regard to abusive relationships is just leave, but it's far more complex than that. So could you speak to the complexities of that? Why is it difficult to get out of these really toxic relationships?
So when a victim of domestic violence is leaving or separating from a relationship, it's actually the most dangerous time. We're here in my office in Toledo Municipal Court. Behind me are some women from our community who were attempting to leave their abusive partners and were murdered as a result of that, which is tragic and very much my focus every day as we handle these cases and work towards prevention of that ultimate tragic outcome. But it is not easy. It's dangerous. Additionally, when you've been isolated, you don't feel like you have any support or resources or anywhere to turn. Additionally, there are financial implications, particularly for adults. When there are children involved, it's very hard to leave, someone who is the other parent of your children, in addition to what is often the strongest emotion of all, which is love. We are talking about people who have a connection, who do care about each other, and the relationship is not always 100% unhealthy and toxic. There are good times too, and it, I think, is human nature to want to think about those things and not focus on the bad so much.
Would you say there have been a lot more cases of people seeking out resources because of these preventative efforts, or have things not really changed too much?
Well, we've had a huge change since the 1970s when community resources really started getting funded by the government, when domestic violence became a crime in the state of Ohio and in most states across the country, all states now. But yeah, there was a time where there were not shelters available to victims and their children, where there weren't hotlines. And since putting those things in place, we have seen a major change in what's available to victims and how they're able to reach out and access those resources. Additionally, with technology, like you said, there are lots of websites, lots of chat features for victims to be able to reach out 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But it takes a lot to get to that point. And so I encourage anybody who is experiencing such a thing to use your resources, take a look at what's out there, and start making a plan.
Something I want to revisit, you mentioned that your court sees thousands of cases annually with regard to domestic violence. Of course, there still is a backlog of cases that courts have from the pandemic. How difficult is it for your office to really keep up with this sheer amount of cases locally?
Well, I'm very proud to say that we have a robust domestic violence prosecution unit here in Toledo Municipal Court. We have 3 full-time prosecutors who are dedicated to these cases, who are specially trained, share a passion and a focus for this unique crime. And so they are able to keep up and are doing a wonderful job at that. And because of our rules of superintendents here in Ohio, we do not have a backlog. We are staying on top of our speedy trial rights for all defendants here and moving cases forward. But it really is the specialty of our domestic violence prosecutors to give victims the time and attention that they deserve.
Coming off of that, would you say we've seen a general decline locally?
Unfortunately, domestic violence cases remain steady. 2,000 cases has pretty much been the average for the last 20 years here in Toledo since we've been keeping data.
Looking into the future, what are some other supports that could maybe help in addressing this issue that maybe have not become the topic of conversation just yet?
Well, I think this summit is going to be a great way to address that. Again, we're engaging youth, but we also have professionals from different areas. So we've got medical folks who are coming together. We have our police and our court system, of course, represented, but also the education system, teachers, different folks from different walks of life who see this issue play out in different ways. And so it will be really nice to get us all around the table to start having this conversation together.
And I think it's important to note that statistically, there's a possibility that some of us do know someone who is in a relationship that could end up becoming more toxic. And so what should individuals be looking for just in terms of friends and family? Obviously, we don't know the full extent of someone's experiences, but what are some things that we should all keep in mind? Because we can be observers and potentially prevent a tragedy.
Absolutely, and interveners as well. I think that if we suspect that someone we care about is in an abusive relationship, it's important to let them know that we're there to support them whenever they are ready, without putting the pressure of, why are you putting up with this? You need to just leave. This is, not worth your time. Kind of minimizing the impact and the emotional pressure that a victim is feeling. But additionally, it's really important for us to speak up when somebody we care about is causing the abuse. And when they are using hurtful language towards a partner, when we see them using isolating tactics, when we see them being manipulative, to call that behavior out for what it is and let them know, we don't like that. That's unacceptable. Because a big problem that I see is a lack of accountability for abusers. And the battered women's movement that has created the hotlines and the shelters and all of the grant funding associated with those things really is focused on providing resources to victims, which is wonderful. But victims aren't the problem. They're not creating domestic violence. We're trying to help them escape it. But if we really want to get to the heart of the issue, we need to hold abusers accountable.
Yeah, and one thing we've really hammered in this conversation is prevention. And so is there anything you would like to see in terms of more support, whether from the state or federal level, in terms of increasing prevention efforts?
Well, certainly. I hope the Violence Against Women Act continues, that the funding to our advocates here locally and across the country continue. But I'm really excited about this opportunity to partner with Toledo Public Schools for this summit and to bring the high school students to this conversation, but also for these professionals to be able to come back and share their resources within the school so that we're not just waiting for folks to grow up and show up in the court system, but we're building those relationships earlier. We're letting folks know what resources are available, so if and when they're seeing these things, they know the way out.
Finally here, just to get those resources out there, what are some different options that folks have locally in terms of getting connected to people that can maybe help them if they're in a situation where they don't feel comfortable and they feel that things aren't heading in a good direction?
Yeah, well, obviously the courts are here for all criminal offenses as well as protection orders for people who are family or household relationships, are eligible for protection orders through the family court, including teenagers. Due to Shanira's law, Shanira Grant was a young woman just graduated from Start High School who was murdered by her boyfriend here in Toledo right after graduating back in, I believe, 2005. And through the work of her mother and many advocates, we made it so that teenagers are eligible, for teen dating violence protection orders through the juvenile court. So that's something we'll certainly be addressing at the summit and making sure that students and young people know that. But additionally, there is the YWCA, which is an emergency shelter for folks who are not safe and need an immediate place to go for themselves and their children to get out of a violent relationship. So I want to make sure that everybody know that that exists, that there is always an opportunity to get out and be safe.
Well, City of Toledo Toledo Chief Prosecutor Rebecca Facey. I appreciate you coming on the show this week, obviously to discuss this difficult but important topic. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jaden. I really appreciate your time. It's so good to see you again.
Thank you, and that is this week's edition of Behind the Byline from the Toledo Free Press.